Howdy folks, welcome back to the Kentuckian. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Glad that you've decided to give us a try. I hope that you'll like the content that we have, and I hope that you'll gain something from it. There's a common criticism by the left and by libertarians as well of the conservative side of things, the right, however you want to phrase that, about having what they smugly refer to as moral panics. The criticism most commonly shows up today when certain sorts of sexual degeneracy that are very common today are brought into the limelight, so to speak. They're kind of, people are letting them know, hey, this certain thing is going on. Maybe it's a drag show story hour at the local library, or you know, drag shows where they're bringing very small kids to at bars, that sort of stuff. And there's been a big deal made about them. Many of you would probably say understandably so. I would agree, but we'll get into that. But a lot of criticism is given like, oh, it's just a moral panic. It's just a moral panic. You all are overreacting. It's not a big deal. They'll even try and say, well, if it wouldn't be a big deal. It wouldn't be weird if you didn't imply it was weird, like there wasn't anything innately sexual and perverted about what they do, all that sort of stuff. That's what we're going to talk about today, but specifically the idea of a moral panic. And like, is that a legitimate criticism? What's kind of the philosophy behind it or the thinking behind it and those sorts of things. So a moral panic can basically be defined, and you'll find kind of various definitions, but they'll line up decently close to this. Basically defined as an unreasonable fear about some behavior or perhaps product, including sometimes a specific group's general behavior, common behavior, or maybe even universal across that group. Things that they do, characteristics about the group, that sort of stuff. Now, I want to start off by saying that I am not saying that the idea of a moral panic at all is preposterous. Moral panics can and do happen. You might think about, there was a time when there was a big deal made about music, and there was a big thing with labeling, and there was explicit music that was becoming popular, and you know, should it be allowed? Should there be special labels put on it? Should it be restricted, and who can get it? And there was kind of a compromise with that. That's sort of where the music rating system came out, and kind of some requirements that you had to label certain things as explicit, but it wasn't also taken off of store shelves, that sort of thing. And there was a little bit of a moral panic there. There were some things, while there were legitimate concerns, there was also a lot of stuff that was unreasonable or kind of taken way farther than it needed to be taken. The problem wasn't necessarily what they were saying it was, what people were getting all worked up about. Another thing that is a little bit more recent that you all may know about is the outcry that comes out at various times about violent video games. And again, this is not to say that there aren't some legitimate criticisms or concerns about violent video games, especially certain ones. But at the same time, the idea that violent video games cause mass shootings and murders and all sorts of violent crime, there's no real evidence for that. There never really has been either. Again, not to say that there aren't concerns, not to say that there aren't considerations, even moral ones, about violent video games. And again, specific kinds. A big one at the time, I believe it was the first Grand Theft Auto game that came out, and that's a series now. There's about 5 or 6 of them, if I'm not mistaken. And it's basically you play as a criminal. That's the whole point of the game. There's a story where you're doing criminal things, and you can do whatever you want, including violent acts, again, random violent acts and that sort of stuff. And again, they're not saying there's not any considerations or concerns there, but the idea that that causes people to go and be criminals or to be violent, a lot of violent video games like war shooters and first-person shooters like the old Call of Duty games and Battlefield and those sorts of games. The idea that they are causing certain violent behaviors, causing crime, there is actually, in fact, there's data that indicates the exact opposite may be happening. But there was a huge outrage. I mean, lots of people, and there's a lot of people today. In fact, you may disagree with me on that, and you may want to let me know in the comments that, well, violent video games do cause people to be psychopathic murderers or whatever. But again, there's just not much evidence for that problem. We have to be able to understand that difference, that I can say there may be legitimate concerns about the content that young people, that people in general are consuming, without saying things that aren't necessarily true, without taking it too far. And that's kind of the key with a moral panic. There may be legitimate concerns, but that's usually not the focus of a moral panic. The idea of a panic, it kind of makes sense, right? Panics are not logical, they're not reasonable, they tend to be very emotional, and they get out of hand very quickly. So they can happen, but we also need to think about the qualifiers to have a moral panic, especially as we bring it back to today and what's going on today. So one, there needs to be relatively widespread outrage or a large-scale effort to cause outrage about a specific behavior, about a product, whatever the case might be. Also, it has to be unreasonable, and that's another key. So, if there's an attempt on a small scale to try and make people make a big deal out of it, and they don't, well, that's not a moral panic. You could say maybe you're trying to start a moral panic, but that's not a moral panic. And also, if people are worked up about something that is actually really bad and they're being reasonable about why they're worked up about it, that's not a moral panic either. That's just regular moral outrage, and it's actually justified. So think about those two qualifiers, and then let's think about what's going on today. Because moral concern and moral outrage is by no means always unreasonable. It really gets to the rotten postmodern core of leftism and libertarianism when they make these sorts of accusations of moral panic, because effectively what you get to with them is that there's never a reason to be morally morally outraged or morally concerned, because they don't believe in absolute morals. That starts to get to the core of it. We'll jump into that a little bit more as we go along, but we need to understand that being morally concerned about something is not bad. They believe it is because they don't believe in absolute morals, especially if you don't agree with them. So let's examine what they say people are having a moral panic about today. A lot of the things that people are concerned about have to do, to a large degree, to the modern degenerate philosophies that stem from the widespread acceptance of postmodernism, which we're not talking about postmodernism in detail, but very briefly, that can briefly be summed up by saying that it believes that there is no absolute. There's no absolute standard, no absolute truth. Sometimes when you get really deep into it, even to the point of existence. That's basically postmodernism. It's most practically applicable when it comes to moral and ethical concerns. There's no absolute standard, there's no absolute truth. And the problems that are common today that they claim their moral panics about really began to heavily manifest. The results of these philosophies that led to where we are today really began to heavily manifest during the sexual revolution that started in the 1960s and was heavy in the 60s and the 70s. That actually has a very strong connection to communism, but we're not focusing on that right now. Just kind of a fun little thing there. Most of the issues today are directly or indirectly, but very closely related to sex, sexual acts, and sexuality. And it's because of these postmodern philosophies, the connection to the sexual revolution and some other stuff, and that's where we've gotten where we're at today. Now, going deeper into this history could be helpful, and we will almost undoubtedly do it in other episodes, but that's not the focus of this one. We're going to avoid most of that for today, other than what I've kind of said just a second ago, and I'll say a little bit more, but we're not going to go in depth. While we can trace a thread of gradual acceptance of various moral degeneracies, and let me remind you what's, say degenerate sounds harsh, I want to step back for a second, define that term. Degenerate, think about the core word there, generate. It has to do with a collapse, if you will, a degradation. So when you're talking about sexual degeneracy, you're talking about a degradation in sexual acts. You talk about moral degeneracy, you're talking about a degradation in moral character and moral, behavior and decisions. So just using the word degenerate, you can use it in a very mean, spiteful way, but that's not the only way to use it. Remember back, if you watched last week's episode, that's something we talked about, remembering the general context of words. I wanted to take this opportunity to remind us of that, and also to define that term a little bit more. We can trace this thread of the gradual acceptance of increasingly degenerate sexual action and sexual beliefs and behavior, and it led to where we are now. It explains how we can be so calm, because in general, society takes very little note of much of the crazy stuff that goes on today, sexual or not, just morally ambiguous or, well, really morally evil things that are very common today that we don't even think about all too often. It really explains how we can be so calm about those things. and really total perversion that's all around us. But for today, I want to focus on where we are now and actually trying to wake up to the insanity around us. Tracing that gradual acceptance is important, and we need to realize that that's how we got on a lot of things, because we let little changes build up over time until we are so far from where we started we don't even recognize ourselves. That actually happens a lot in life and a lot of different things, but that's not the focus today. I want to focus on really thinking about now. Let's take a step back and realize just how bad things are, and that's not meant to be like, oh, we're in so much trouble, everything's going to fall apart, let's panic. Not saying that. We don't want any kind of panic, moral or otherwise. It's if we can wake up and see where we are, then we can do something about it, right? It might be a grim situation if we're being frank, but if we know what the situation is, we can actually get real pathways to fix it or to make it better. So, you know, it's not about being a doomer and just, oh, everything's so awful. It's let's see where we are. Let's be honest with ourselves so then we can make it better. That's the key, right? So, some of the things that are probably the most commonly talked about and also the most common to receive this criticism of conservatives causing a moral panic over it. And I'm going to put it in a way that they don't ever package it as, but it's realistic to what's going on. So a big thing is extremely young kids being exposed to overly sexual drag shows. Now, I want you to step back for just a second. You know what I'm talking about, but notice how I used extremely young as a qualifier to this bad thing that's going on, as if 14-year-olds going to what are basically sex shows is any better than 3-year-olds going to what are basically sex shows. I hope that you maybe can see that words and phrasing, you know, specific word choice and phrasing can be used and are used very often to manipulate our perception of things around us. And specifically for today, our acceptance or lack of acceptance towards morally evil behavior. You know, you'll see it if you pay attention. When even looking at people that have legitimate concerns and they're bringing up these things because they want it fixed, they'll talk about there's no reason first graders should be exposed to this stuff. Why would they expose kids that are so young to this stuff? That's absolutely a valid point. But why are they exposing kids to it at all? You know, why? Okay, yeah, first graders shouldn't be exposed to it, but so sixth graders shouldn't be exposed to it, and really 11th and 12th graders shouldn't be exposed to it. You can argue nobody should be, but that's the world we live in, so we do have to be realistic about that. We can't just stick our heads in the sand. But at the same time, if we are not careful about how we phrase things, well, now what we're doing is we're effectively telling ourselves, well, you know, okay, as long as it's not the first graders, you know, the sixth graders, I'm not saying that's good, but we'll make do. No, that's not acceptable. And we have to be careful about that phrasing. As a side point, what was commonly called the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, although it didn't really have it never said that in the bill, but it was about keeping kids from being exposed to some of this material. And it was good for what it was, but while there was a really, really big deal made out of it, and it was a good step, don't get me wrong, at the same time, the bill only covered, I think, up to like fourth graders not being exposed to this material. It wasn't more than fourth. It may actually be less. I should have looked this up beforehand. In fact, I will put up right here, hopefully, a pop-up that'll show what exactly it was. But yeah, it's good. It's good that there's legislation on the books so that first and second graders aren't exposed to this stuff. But it's not good enough, right? That doesn't fix the issue. If we think well, see, he did something and that's good enough, then we're going to lose, right? We're just kind of stopping the bleeding a little bit, and we're ignoring that there are still big problems. Just because first graders are no longer being exposed to it doesn't mean that sixth graders should be exposed to it. We should still be just as aggravated about that, just as worked up about that. So hopefully you see, again, think about that phrasing. Think about, well, yeah, extremely young kids shouldn't be exposed to overly sexual drag shows, but no kid should be exposed to it. Start thinking that way. Start paying attention to those patterns, and you'll start to you'll be surprised how things start to connect in your head. Schools that are full of sexually explicit material in the name of inclusivity and education. Wow, I got both of those words mixed up. Inclusivity and education. And it's not just available like in the school libraries, which is bad enough. It's pushed, it's taught, it's in the classroom very often, and they're teaching kids. And again, especially it happens to young school age children. That doesn't make it okay for older school age children. But you're talking about first graders being exposed to sexually explicit material that is describing sexual intercourse and all sorts of horrible, horrible stuff. That again, well, actually, it probably falls under the category of PORN. And the reason I don't just say the word is because if I understand correctly, if I use that word too much, then it can cause some problems on YouTube. So referring to sexually explicit material, generally today meant for entertainment purposes. Hopefully you understand what I'm getting at there. But that's in classrooms, that's in school libraries as material that kids are being exposed to and are being even taught in some cases. Why in the world? And again, not just teenagers, like that makes it better. First graders, I mean, almost as early as they can expose kids to this, they're exposing kids to this kind of stuff. Transgenderism is fully accepted, and it's being pushed, and that's going into, and this is in schools too, especially in schools, it's going into things like transspeciesism and transageism, where people are pretending to be animals, or they're pretending to be a different age than they are. There's some guy in Europe he's like a 55-year-old. He's pretending to be 8 years old, or a 6-year-old girl. I'm not making that up. It's awful. And that is becoming more and more common. The transspeciesism, people are doing body modifications. They're even in schools, they're dressing up as cats and dogs, and they're getting schools to put in litter boxes in the bathroom. So it's absolutely insane. And that's being accepted and pushed on kids, and of course on parents and adults by extension, that this should just be okay. No, that's not okay. Why in the world would that ever be okay? And yet we don't even think about it half the time. It's like, oh yeah, it's going on. And I've talked to a lot of people that still have no idea that sort of stuff is going on in schools and is relatively common. And I have another note about that I'll get to at the end. But we need to realize that even in areas that we grew up in, perhaps that maybe are rural areas, or we would never expect that sort of thing to really ever take hold, it's taking hold. And again, people have no idea, and then they're being completely blown away because they didn't know that sort of stuff was going on in their local county school, because they never thought it would, right? I mean, this is just whatever county. It's just rural. Everybody's pretty tame. Well, it's infecting everywhere. So that's kind of some of the general things. You all can fill in the blanks, right? You all can think of 100 other issues that have come up in the news where somebody's doing something like that. It's awful, it's degenerate, and of course, bad enough on a societal level, especially because kids are really being drawn into it very heavily over the last few years. That's on purpose. We're not focusing on that, but there is a reason that they want to bring kids into it. But what is the practical application of that? I really want to bring it home to think about, okay, yeah, it's just bad politics. Well, yes and no. It is bad politics. But what does it really mean? It means we've got 50-year-old men that let their hair grow out and put on some lipstick going into women's bathrooms. It means that we've got boys and men and girls' locker and changing rooms, just even in high school and those sorts of things. Do you remember what happened in Loudoun County, Virginia? Maybe you never heard about it. Where some girl got sexually assaulted, and there's stronger words to use for it as well, but got sexually assaulted by some guy that pretended he was a girl, and then Loudoun County sent him to a different school and tried to cover it up, where the same thing happened again. And they've tried to cover that up for years now. I guess it's probably 2 years ago that it happened. That's real. That's somebody's daughter. That's daughters, because there was more than one person that was affected by it. That's somebody's daughters that are in changing rooms and locker rooms with a guy pretending to be a girl, and then leading to other actions far more than just that's just wrong, that sort of exposure is going on, leading to other stuff like sexual assault and those sorts of things. The bottom line is we need to understand that it's reasonable to be outraged about these things. It's reasonable to be outraged that your daughter at school may be exposed to guys without any clothes on because they say they're a girl for today. And again, guys being guys, even girls being girls, but you talk about the biological desires when it comes to reproduction, when it comes to sexual activity and other things like that, that is natural, that is then perverted by all the stuff going on today, by the stuff they're getting in schools, by all the junk they're watching on the computer and on their phone, and by what everybody in the culture is telling them, what their friends are telling them, what media is telling them, TV, movies. It's all okay. Just do what you want. Do what feels good. And then they're going in and they're doing stuff to people and hurting people, sexual assault and all sorts of other stuff because of this. That's like real tangible results. And yeah, that's somebody's daughter that's happening. That's somebody's son that's happening to. And it could be yours. It could be your neighbors. It could be your brothers or your sister's children that's happening to. If you're young enough, it could be your brother or your sister. That's the real practical effects of this kind of stuff. And it is not unreasonable at all to be outraged and to be concerned about this kind of stuff. At all. We should be outraged and concerned about it because that's a reasonable reaction to this kind of insanity. It shouldn't be that hard to figure out, frankly. And there's a lot of people that'll get mad at you for being outraged about that sort of thing, for being aggravated, for saying this is wrong, this needs to stop, and they'll get all high and mighty. Who are you to think you can say what's right or wrong? Who are you to think you can tell us how to live and all this kind of other self-righteous stuff? Ironic considering they believe that there is no objective morality. We'll talk about that more in a second. But let me ask you. Maybe you even think, well, I mean, look, we shouldn't be outraged. Yeah, we need to deal with it, but yeah, what's the big deal? Well, if you can't see the big deal, maybe we need to have a separate discussion, frankly. But if we can't be if we and this goes especially for the folks that are like, well, yeah, I'm aggravated about it, but if I make a big deal about it, something bad could happen to me. Or we really shouldn't get too mad about this. We need to just deal with the results. And I certainly don't believe in letting emotion rule the day. We do need to be logical and reasonable and disciplined. But at the same time, we need to get fired up so we actually do something about this. If we can't get outraged, if we can't get aggravated, if we can't get worked up about this sort of depravity, about things that are as bad as they are now. And again, very common. This isn't just happening in California. This is happening in California and New York and Kentucky and Alabama. It's happening all over the country. It's happening in Texas. It's happening in Montana. Yeah, maybe it's not as common in some of these areas, but that don't mean it's not common. Because I'm telling you, this stuff is happening in places I would have never guessed it would have happened in. Or at least it would have been, one person that's kind of an outcast that goes down that route and then immediately moves away. It's not. It's not at all. And if we can't get fired up about this kind of stuff, about things that are this bad, then what can we get fired up about? What can we get outraged about? Well, what it boils down, I'll answer that question for you. What it boils down to is we're never going to draw the line anywhere if we don't draw the line somewhere. And why not here? Because we should have drawn the line somewhere else 40 years ago and we didn't. Well, even before that, honestly. But again, we're not going into the history of that right now. Is there nothing good or virtuous or pure or even clean to cling to anymore? That's what they want. They don't want kids to be innocent. They don't want kids to not be exposed to that stuff at early ages. They don't want people to think about virtue, to think about character, to think about right and wrong. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And we're not getting into that today, although maybe we should at some point. And we have before. You could really, this isn't the only reason, but one of the reasons is a morally undisciplined and immoral people that are self-obsessed and only doing what feels right are completely listless and focusless and disciplineless, and they're characterless, they're spineless people, and they're easy to control. Just threaten to take away their pleasure and they'll step right in line. Threaten to put on a little uncomfortableness, they'll step right in line. That's not the only thing at play here, but that's a big part of it, folks, and we need to be realistic about that. But all this being said, it brings us to a key conclusion. And again, and I don't want to get to the point where it's like, oh, he's just being a doomer and he's just gloom and doom, everything's falling apart. Well, again, we need to be realistic. We need to get fired up and we need to do something about it. Yeah, I don't want to be one of these people that just tries to get people fired up and say you need to be outraged about this and then provides no alternative, right? I mean, that doesn't do anybody any good except for maybe the people that make a lot of money off of it because they buy, you buy their subscriptions to their exclusive content. Talk is cheap, right? Let's actually find a way to beat this, to get a solution, to find a solution. And I hope that you're not like just, oh, he's just trying to get people fired up. Yeah, I'm trying to get people fired up because there's something we can do about it. So I do hope that you don't get too discouraged or anything like that, because that's not the point at all. But all this being said, it brings us to a key conclusion. A few key conclusions, but the thing is, when we're considering these problems, we're considering how bad all this stuff is, and just how insane things have gotten, and like, what do we do about it? Do we stand up against it? If we stand up against it, how far do we take it? What do we say? What do we do? I don't want to be hateful, and certainly that's great. We shouldn't be hateful people at all. But it brings us to two options, and this is kind of where we're at as a country. People have to choose one side or the other because the sides are so they're so opposite of each other. You can't have both, right? They're mutually exclusive. It brings us to a point where we have two options. We have to choose to believe one of two things. One, there is a standard. Two, there's not a standard. We have to choose one of those two options. If there is a standard, then this stuff has to stop. Something has to be done about it. We have to stand up against it. If there's not a standard, doesn't matter. That's what it comes down to. We have to choose whether there's right or wrong, or there's not. Now, let me be clear. What we choose, what we personally say, well, I believe that there is an absolute right or wrong or not, does not change the fact of whether there is an absolute right or wrong. There is absolute truth. There is absolute right and wrong. You can choose to reject that. But all of us have to make that decision. And that's what I'm trying to get us to think about. If a moral standard, remember, if a moral standard is subjective, then it's no standard at all. It's not sure. It's not reliable. It's not a standard. It's an opinion. If we know that men shouldn't be allowed in teenage girls' locker rooms, if we know that first graders shouldn't be exposed to sexually explicit drag shows or taught in school or at all perhaps about how to, or well, really at all, about how to conduct homosexual sexual activity like kids are being taught in schools today, if we know that there's right or wrong, we need to stand on that. We should be intolerant. Now, just like I did with that other word earlier, I'm going to take a step back. What is tolerance? You're allowing something to go on. You say it's okay, whatever the case might be. What's intolerance? You're not allowing something to go on. You're not tolerant of that, right? Literally not tolerant or whatever. But you don't accept that as being okay or being acceptable or whatever. Well, there's some things that shouldn't be tolerated. Murder shouldn't be tolerated. Sexualizing children shouldn't be tolerated. Not the way they're doing it. Yes, there needs to be education, but that's not sexualizing children. That's teaching them what they need to know. You're talking about biology lessons and certain things like that, and moral lessons, not, hey, do whatever you want when it comes to sexual things. Identify however you want. There's no truth. You can identify as whatever. You might really be a girl when you're actually a boy. That's sexualizing, right? Exposing them to these drag shows that are about as close to a strip joint as you can without actually taking clothes off, although sometimes they do end up stripping some too. But, kids being exposed, that's sexualizing children. That's not educating them. That's not teaching them what they need to know. You shouldn't tolerate that. You shouldn't tolerate tyranny. You shouldn't tolerate a government just sitting back and doing whatever it wants to its people because it doesn't have the authority to. There are things that you should be intolerant of. And again, we've been taught that, well, intolerance is bad. And the very premise, though, think about this for a second. The very premise of saying intolerance is innately evil no matter what is kind of the only thing that isn't tolerated is intolerance. Philosophy. Well, everything's okay unless you don't agree with that. And then it's not okay. Well, hold on. If we're supposed to be totally tolerant, if there's no absolute truth and everybody's just as right as everybody else, then you can't say that those that are intolerant are bad. But they do. The very premise that you can, the only thing that is not tolerable is intolerance is fallacious, and it's idiotic foolishness. It's idiotic. It's doublethink at its peak, at its prime. You can think two things simultaneously that are literally opposite. They're exclusive to each other. You can't say you're for tolerance and then not tolerate people that don't agree with you. And yet that's what happens all the time. They're not tolerant. Or they're not, yes, excuse me, they're not, I got myself confused there. They're not tolerant. They're just tolerant of people that agree with them. And if you don't, then they're intolerant, just like they claim you are. And you may be, and you should be about certain things if it's based off truth. You know, we're coming back to absolute moral standards. What we need to realize is when there is something that is morally reprehensible, that is definitively morally reprehensible, we have the responsibility to be morally outraged about it. If not, if we say that there is no absolute moral standard, if we say that moral outrage is always bad because everything's subjective, that you're just enforcing your moral standard on other people and all that, well, the conclusion is literally anything goes. If there is no absolute moral standard, we can't condemn Hitler for all the evil that he did. We can't condemn Stalin or Mao. We can't condemn, Jeffrey Dahmer, the murdering cannibal, or any other psychopath or criminal or murderer or anything else, or worse. We can never condemn them because all morality is subjective. That's what it leads to. There's absolute truth, or it's Wild West out there. It's free for all. You can't say anything is wrong. And we all know, if we're honest with ourselves, that the idea of not being able to say anything is wrong, especially when we can see in front of our eyes just how bad things are today, is ridiculous and it's unacceptable. We should be intolerant of that. Again, using that in the more general, correct definition, not the very specific politicized political theater definition that they like to change your perception so that you hear a certain word and you have an emotional reaction instead of a logical reaction. Now, a couple qualifiers to that. Individually, we should always stand for, search for, and fight for the truth. Absolutely. Collectively, thinking about community governance and governance in general, that sort of thing, there has to be some flexibility because people take time to grow. Humans are flawed. We have to make decisions on our own. There has to be a balance when you're talking about collective enforcement of absolute right and wrong. You have to have balance. Humans cannot properly police and enforce a divine moral law. We're humans, we're flawed. We can't do that. That's why individual choice is so important. That's why freedom is so important. We need to recognize that. Individually, we have to always stand and be adamant about the truth. Collectively, we have to be a little flexible. And we still have to eventually say there's absolute right and wrong, and some things are not tolerated, right? It's kind of that balance of, they say, well, if you say that, if you want to make certain things illegal, well, you're just enforcing your religion. Well, it's very different to try and enforce moral behavior that's found in the divine word, in the word of God, about murder and even some things, and there's a balance here, but you could even make arguments about things like adultery and not taking care of your family and other things that, according to the Bible, murder and sexual assault and, take your pick, right? Those things are wrong. Thieving, fraud, covetousness. Well, not covetousness. That's not the word I'm thinking of. False witness. I don't know where I got those two mixed up. False witness, that idea of lying in a court of law and all these different things. Yes, that's a Christian moral standard, but it's right. That's not the same as saying you have to go to this specific church and pay taxes to this specific church. You have to follow this specific church's doctrinal teachings, or so on. And that's what it comes down to, right? That balance of, yes, we have to enforce a moral standard, but there does have to be some flexibility because each individual has to make the choice to do what's right. And there has to be a certain amount of flexibility on the collective level for judgment because people can't properly enforce God's word. We're flawed. We're not meant to have that much influence over our fellow man. And when a government gets that much power, it quickly becomes a problem. Even when you read in like Romans 13, where God explains more thoroughly what a government's responsibility is to do is to uphold good and to punish evil. Well, that's general, but that focuses far more, and as you read on a little bit more, it focuses very much on the moral behavior of people. If somebody steals from somebody, the government has a responsibility, a divine responsibility and authorization to punish that person, to deal with that problem. So there is a balance there, and I do want to make sure that that's clear. That's a part of the practical application. Individually, we have to fight. Government-wise, there is a balance. There has to be a little bit of there has to be flexibility, and you can't get into the theocracy level, because the idea of a God-ruled government is great, except that God doesn't rule governments like that, right? He's only ever done that with like one country, the Kingdom of Israel, back in the Old Testament. So let's keep that in mind as well. Let's understand, think about context and nuance, right? Like, yes, we need to do this. And individually, even collectively on a non-government level, there's things that we need to stand for. And there's things we need to push for on a governmental level, but those aren't always the same, right? Different contexts, different organizations, different groups, different authorizations and responsibilities. We need to recognize that. And no, freedom is not just the do whatever you want as long as it doesn't hurt anyone. We've talked about this before. The whole premise behind it is flawed. Well, that's a moral standard, and you're using that as an absolute moral standard, but you don't believe in absolute moral standards, so you're just making it up. And the smug moral panic folks that'll criticize you for being legitimately concerned about something, for being mildly concerned about something that is very degenerate or very odd in a very immoral way, for having something solid to stand on, are the same people that say, absolutely, well, as long as you don't hurt anyone, it shouldn't matter what you do. And that's just their opinion by their own premise and by their own admission, because they don't believe in absolute truth. It's mind-bendingly backwards and circular reasoning. And we need to understand that, yeah, they can be smug and confident all they want, but they're not right. And they don't even have a logically consistent argument to make. And as I'm about to finish, before I get to the closing remarks, I do want to make a special note to my Southern brethren. Of course, I'm a proud Kentuckian, as you might have guessed from the title. And the South has always been separate and kind of its own world. And we need to be really careful about this very issue, about thinking, well, not thinking in a certain sense, not realizing how bad things have gotten. The South has been basically what's comprised what's called the Bible Belt, very religious, very, very Christ-oriented. It's been that way for basically its whole existence, and that's wonderful. But these things are far too common in our fair land of Dixie, and we need to understand that, folks. We have dropped the ball in the preservation of our heritage and of our culture, and especially of our morals. Even recently, over the last few months, finding out about things going on in parts of the fair Commonwealth of Kentucky that I would have never expected, not in that area. Sure, maybe around Louisville, maybe around Lexington, but certainly not in the areas that I've heard about this kind of stuff going on, this kind of stuff being accepted. People going in and criticizing a preacher because he'll preach the truth about homosexuality from the Word of God, and demonizing people, and fights nearly starting, and drag show story hours in libraries, or very similar stuff to that, and all this kind of thing in rural counties in Kentucky where you would have never dreamed of it. And that's the same story all across the South. That's why I mentioned that earlier. These things aren't just happening in California. They aren't just happening in New York. It's infecting the South as well as everywhere else, and we need to drive it from our lands. We need to drive this evil from our lands. We need to start taking it seriously and realizing that we have to do something to stop it. There's lots of different things that we can do, but fundamentally, know what's right and stand on it. Don't be afraid to admit that to your friends and family or to your coworkers, because you say this is right, and you don't have to like it, you don't have to agree with it, but it doesn't change reality. And getting the word out there, whether that's helping the Kentuckian to do it, helping other groups to do it, or talking to people yourself, actually studying and knowing what you believe and why you believe it, what's right and wrong, and learning to defend that and live that. That's some of the most important stuff you can do. Help other people to do the same. Maybe a little bit of solicitation for the Kentuckian there. But I do want especially my like I said, my Southern brethren, the Southern sisters, as they used to be called, especially all the different southern states, we need to realize that it's not just California. It's not just where the Yankees are or anything like that. It's happening right here on our home turf. And it's going to keep happening. It's going to keep getting worse unless we do something about it. And, you know, the South has quite the heritage. That's something that I don't always talk about a lot. I'm going to talk about more and more. And it's very controversial, at least outside of the South especially, although to some degree inside the South too. But we need to defend it. We need to know what it is. We need to take the things that were bad and make sure that they're fixed, and then move on and learn from them and make the South and make Southern heritage and culture even better. And of course, that would be the same for America. That'd be the same for the world. But I am especially appealing to those people that I have a personal connection with, being a Southerner myself. And we need to do something about it. You know, we've got work to do. We need to grit our teeth. We need to dig our heels in. We need to go to work. That's what we've got to do, folks. And again, that would go over the same for the whole country, but especially to the South. We're the best hope for this country. I know a lot of people ain't gonna like that. I know a lot of people don't like that idea. A lot of people hate the South. A lot of people in this country hate the South. But when we're talking about this kind of stuff, we're talking about morality and right and wrong and the future of this country. The best hope is right here in Dixie. And that's just the way it is. We have a responsibility. We've got an opportunity to do good, to make a difference, to be a leader in this country for what people need to be doing. And so we need to do it. We need to be that leader. We need to be that example. We need to grit our teeth and go to the work. We've always been a tough people in our heritage and our history, and generally been a fairly moral people. But that's changing. And unless we do something to stop it, it's going to keep getting worse. And personally, I'm not content with that. I'm doing something right now to change it. I hope that you'll do the same too. Well, anyway, that's my last main point for this episode. I had my special address to the South. And if you don't like that, I'm not going to apologize for it. That's the way it is. But I do thank you all for listening. I hope that you've gained something from it. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that it's motivated you. There's so much more that needs to be done, but there is a way out. There is hope. Or as I've said before, I wouldn't be here doing this if I didn't think there wasn't something that could be done. Helping to share the Kentuckian helps grow our audience, helps me to get the word out there more. It makes a huge difference. All those algorithms and how people and when people see my content, that sort of stuff, it helps with all of that. Liking videos, making comments, telling me what you want to see. You know, you can comment about anything. Tell me what you want to see in the next video, saying you agree with something, saying you disagree with something. It all makes a difference. It really does help. And I hope that you'll be involved. Don't forget our social media pages. I'm still not great about updating those, but I am making a little bit of progress, and I'm trying to, you know, make sure that I'm updating that at least some. So make sure you check those out. That is a good source of information. And don't forget the Patreon. If you'd like to support the Kentuckian in a more personal way, support me in a more personal way, I do have a Patreon. I want to thank my patrons. I do really appreciate their support. And if you'd be interested in joining that, there are some special perks and benefits. And as that grows, I want to grow what perks and benefits there are for my patrons. But if you'd be interested in that link for the Patreon is down in the description of this video, as well as the links for the social media and that sort of stuff. Don't forget the Rumble channel as well. I don't get as many views on there because most of my views are on YouTube or Spotify. Listens on Spotify, of course, right now. But there is the same content there. I will probably eventually have some exclusive content on Rumble as well to sort of incentivize people to go to that. YouTube is very predatory. And don't forget that we have some new stuff coming out. That's new content. So the shorts videos, I have not gotten those out as I've originally planned, but hopefully there should be something soon. I have made some progress on that, and with the storefront as well. Don't forget the storefront. I have some great merchandise. Not all is directly Kentuckian themed, but still patriotic or very cool merchandise that I think you all will like. I have some new designs coming out there soon as well, or some new products with old designs. So hopefully, make sure you check that out. And if you find something, that money, that does help me, of course, helps the Kentuckian, and you all get something out of it as well. So I hope that you all have a wonderful week, and I hope that you all will remember that as long as you and I are doing what's right, like we've been talking about today, as long as you all and me are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this whole world. This has been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.